December 8th, 1941. 08 hours, Gin Drinkers Line, mainland Hong Kong. The morning broke not with a dawn, but with a colossal roar. It was the sound of war arriving in an entirely unprepared theater. Japanese shells, delivered with punishing precision, slammed into the thinly held fortifications of the Gin Drinkers Line. A defensive barrier the British command had foolishly assured its troops was impenetrable. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the horrifying smell of cordite. Hong Kong, a tiny, opulent colonial outpost, was suddenly and brutally dragged into the maelstrom of the Second World War. Among those bearing the brunt of the assault were 2 battalions of young, inexperienced, yet fiercely determined Canadian soldiers, the Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers. They were poorly equipped, having been dispatched to the Pacific Theatre only weeks before, largely for a show of force. They expected a quiet colonial posting. They received a massacre. The Canadian troops, many still learning how to operate their obsolete rifles, suddenly faced the elite, jungle-hardened 38th Division of the Imperial Japanese Army, a force that outnumbered the entire Allied garrison by more than 2 to 1 and possessed total air superiority. This was not a fair fight. This was a siege disguised as a battle. The initial assault on the mainland was terrifyingly swift. By the afternoon of December 9th, the Japanese had already achieved the impossible, exploiting a crucial gap and overrunning the main strong point. The Canadian forces, fighting desperately from exposed positions, were forced into a chaotic, bloody retreat. One unit, the Winnipeg Grenadiers, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel J.G. Home, was caught in the path of the relentless Japanese advance. Their mission quickly devolved from holding a line to conducting a series of desperate, delaying actions, buying precious hours for the main British forces to consolidate on Hong Kong Island itself. In the thick of this retreat was Company A of the Winnipeg Grenadiers, under the unofficial but powerful command of Warrant Officer Class 2, Sergeant Major John Robert Osborne. Osborne was an anomaly among his young charges. A World War I veteran, a man of quiet authority and immense physical presence. He had seen war before. He knew the difference between panic and organized withdrawal. As the company withdrew across the Kowloon Peninsula, under constant fire and with the sounds of battle closing in, Osborne was the rock. He organized stragglers, ensured the wounded were carried, and, most importantly, kept his young soldiers focused on their immediate objective, survival and fighting retreat. December 13th, 1941. Shao Kei Wan area, Hong Kong Island. After a brief, horrifying crossing of the harbor, a moment of relative calm amidst the storm, the Canadian forces found themselves regrouped on the island. The second phase of the defense. The island defense was supposed to be stronger, but the overwhelming speed and brutality of the Japanese advance had shattered morale and command structures. Osborne's Company A was repositioned to defend the area around Jardine's Lookout and Mount Butler, a series of high, rugged peaks that offered the last clear view over the vital eastern coast. This position was critical. If the Japanese captured these heights, they could direct devastating artillery fire onto the main British positions and the vital defensive coastlines. The fighting on Mount Butler became the climax of the Canadian resistance. On the morning of December 19th, the Japanese launched a massive, coordinated assault against the Grenadiers' positions. The fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal, and fought across incredibly difficult, rocky terrain. Osborne was everywhere. He led counterattacks with fixed bayonets, silencing enemy machine gun nests single-handedly. He organized desperate resupply runs under heavy mortar fire. He ensured that when one position fell, another was immediately established, refusing to allow the line to buckle completely. For hours, the Canadian soldiers, fueled by Osborne's relentless example, held their ground against wave after wave of fanatical Japanese troops. The position was ultimately untenable. Out of ammunition, surrounded, and with their forward trenches virtually destroyed by incessant shelling. Osborne and his remaining men were finally forced to take cover in a deep, narrow, hastily dug trench. It was a pocket of desperate defiance, a final, fragile shield against the inevitable. Japanese soldiers, having finally breached the position, began to methodically flush out the remaining defenders with grenades, lobbing them down into the confined space, creating terror and chaos. The scene was one of final, utter defeat. A broken Canadian unit, pinned down, facing certain capture or worse. The psychological victory had already been secured by the Japanese, or so they thought. December 19th, 1941, 15 hours. The final trench on Mount Butler, Hong Kong Island. The trench was a shallow, broken scar on the peak of Mount Butler, barely offering cover against the torrent of Japanese machine gun fire and grenades. Sergeant Major John Osborne, caked in mud, sweat, and the grime of days of desperate fighting, was at the center of this final, beleaguered pocket of resistance. His helmet was gone, his uniform was torn, and his face was smeared with ash, but his eyes, sharp and unwavering, were the only source of calm for the half-dozen young grenadiers huddled around him. They were the remnants of Company A, surrounded, out of communication, and knowing that relief was impossible. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of Japanese phosphorus grenades, signaling the relentless method the enemy used to clear out their tenacious foe. Osborne had spent the last hour directing the return fire, organizing the wounded, and personally retrieving discarded ammunition from the bodies of the fallen to keep his men in the fight, even as enemy infantry began probing their shallow defenses. The Canadians had fought like lions, their lack of experience overcome by sheer, stubborn courage. But now, the inevitable final push was upon them. The immediate assault came swiftly and brutally. A wave of Japanese soldiers, their faces grim and determined, crested the rise, forcing Osborne's men to fire their last remaining bursts of Bren gunfire. They inflicted heavy casualties, momentarily repulsing the initial charge. But the counter-response was immediate and devastating. A volley of Type 91 hand grenades arched through the air, their black potato masher shapes falling directly into the confined, narrow trench. The blast from a single grenade in such a space was enough to incapacitate or kill everyone present. The Canadians had seen what these grenades did to flesh and bone. There was no cover, no escape. Panic, a cold, sharp thing, threatened to consume the young soldiers. Osborne, with the terrifying, practiced efficiency of a man who had faced death before, reacted instantly. He roared a warning, a desperate, guttural sound that cut through the noise of battle. He scrambled, grabbing 2 of the deadly iron eggs and flinging them back out of the trench, the blasts deafening but harmlessly overhead. The third grenade, however, landed too deep, lodging itself impossibly close to a cluster of 4 stunned grenadiers. There was no time. The fuse was spitting its final, frantic seconds of life. Osborne, seeing the frozen faces of his young charges, their eyes wide with the raw certainty of impending death, made a choice that transcended the chaos of the moment, a choice of impossible, total sacrifice. He did not hesitate. He did not cry out. With a swift, powerful movement born of desperation and paternal instinct, Sergeant Major John Osborne launched his broken, exhausted body directly onto the grenade. The explosion was immediate and contained, a muffled, brutal punctuation mark in the trench's suffocating silence. The blast, absorbed entirely by Osborne's body, saved the lives of the 4 men huddled beneath him. He was killed instantly, his final act an impossible expression of duty and selflessness. For a moment, The battle noise seemed to recede, leaving only the ringing silence in the ears of the surviving grenadiers. They were alive, saved by an act so profound it defied the grim logic of war. Yet their savior was gone, his sacrifice immediately elevating this small's doomed pocket of resistance to the realm of myth. The Japanese soldiers, having witnessed the suicidal bravery of the last moments of the Canadian defense, secured the position moments later. The survivors, shell-shocked, wounded but alive, were dragged from the trench. The scene confronting the Japanese commander was one of tactical victory, but profound, unsettling psychological shock. They had captured the position, achieved their objective, and destroyed the enemy defense. But there, amidst the wreckage, was the body of the Canadian sergeant major, lying atop the remnants of their grenade. The commander and his officers understood immediately what had happened. This was not a surrender, this was a statement. This was a man, already on the brink of defeat, who chose a terrible, final act of defiance to save the few men under his protection. The sight of the dead Canadian soldier, whose last act was not a plea for mercy but an act of total, uncompromising sacrifice, sent a tremor through the hardened Japanese veterans. They were accustomed to an enemy who surrendered when outnumbered, who broke when outflanked. They had crushed the British defense on the mainland swiftly and brutally, but the spectacle of Osborne's self-immolation, a conscious, deliberate act to protect his subordinates, was utterly unnerving. They had captured the position, yes, but they hadn't broken the enemy's spirit. They realized, with chilling clarity, that the Canadians, and by extension the Allies, were not fighting merely to win, but fighting with a willingness to pay an ultimate price that transcended typical military logic. This broken soldier, lying dead on the shattered ground of Mount Butler, was delivering a terrible, unforeseen prophecy to the Japanese command. December 20th, 1941. 9 hours. Japanese 38th Division Headquarters, Repulse Bay, Hong Kong Island. The mood in the headquarters was one of triumphant exhaustion. Hong Kong was collapsing much faster than anticipated. Reports were flooding in detailing the sheer speed of the advance, the disintegration of the British command structure, and the capture of key defensive positions. Yet, amidst the piles of celebratory documents and maps marked with Japanese flags, there was an unusual, persistent tremor of concern, centered entirely on the fighting on Mount Butler. The commanding officers of the Japanese 38th Division, seasoned veterans who had witnessed the rapid defeat of colonial forces across the Pacific, were deeply unnerved by the final report from the Canadian sector. They had defeated the enemy, but the manner of that defeat was deeply unsettling. The focus was not on the hundreds of prisoners taken, but on one dead man. The report described in chilling, clinical detail the capture of the final trench. The Canadian sergeant major lying dead, his body a shield over his comrades, having deliberately detonated an enemy grenade against his own chest. For the Japanese officers, steeped in the strict, unyielding code of Bushido, which prized loyalty, honor, and death before dishonor. This act was not merely bravery, it was a philosophical thunderbolt. Their own military doctrine embraced the concept of gyokusai, or shattering like a jewel, a glorious death in defense of the emperor. But this was the enemy, a despised Western colonial soldier, exhibiting a transcendent level of self-sacrifice that was supposed to be the exclusive domain of the imperial soldier. The psychological shock was profound. The realization that struck the command was one of dreadful foresight. They could defeat this enemy battalion, they could conquer this island, and they could even win every battle they fought in the short term. But they were facing an opponent who possessed not only the capacity to fight to the last man, but also the willingness to perform an ultimate, conscious act of sacrifice purely to save the lives of his fellow soldiers. This kind of resolution, This depth of loyalty between men suggested an enemy that would never break, regardless of the strategic situation. This single, broken Canadian soldier was a terrifying, physical prophecy of the long, bitter road ahead. The Japanese command realized their tactical victory at Mount Butler was overshadowed by a far greater psychological defeat. They had captured a position, but they had captured a ghost of defiance. The ultimate consequence of the battle came just days later. On Christmas Day, 1941, the garrison of Hong Kong surrendered. The Canadian troops, including the men saved by Osborne, were marched into brutal captivity that would last over 3 years. The conditions in the Japanese prisoner of war camps were horrific, marked by starvation, forced labor, and systemic abuse. Yet, even in the depths of this despair, the story of Sergeant Major John Osborne began its transformation into legend. The survivors of Company A, the men he saved, were the living proof, the immediate witnesses to the final, transcendent act. They recounted the story tirelessly to their fellow prisoners, ensuring the flame of Osborne's sacrifice kept the morale of the entire Canadian contingent alive. His death, a moment of profound defeat, became the ultimate symbol of unbroken Canadian spirit. The testimony of the surviving grenadiers, often smuggled out in coded letters and whispered during clandestine meetings, confirmed the profound moral victory. The Allied failure in the Battle of Hong Kong was a tactical disaster, but Osborne's final moment provided a vital psychological victory. It gave the Allied governments and, more importantly, the families of the captured soldiers a true story of heroism and dignity amidst the tragedy. Osborne's legacy did not end in the trenches of Mount Butler. It sustained the very will to survive in the POW camps. The knowledge that one of their own had faced the moment of truth and chosen self-sacrifice over surrender or escape became a quiet, internal rallying cry. The official recognition for his bravery was delayed by the war and the chaos of capture, but the detailed, consistent testimonies of his comrades, once collated and verified years later, left no doubt. John Osborne's action was deemed to fulfill the highest criteria for military valor. In 1947, he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, VC, the highest military decoration for gallantry in the face of the enemy and the Commonwealth. He was the first Canadian to receive the VC in the Pacific theater of the Second World War. His sacrifice cemented the role of the Canadian forces, despite their heavy loss, as crucial figures in the opening, desperate months of the conflict. The broken soldier the Japanese captured was, in fact, the ultimate message, that the resolve of the Allies, even in defeat, was a force that would ultimately doom the imperial cause. Post-war era, 1947, Rideau Hall, Ottawa, Canada. The surrender of Hong Kong on Christmas Day, 1941, marked one of the most ignominious defeats in Canadian military history. Over 500 Canadian soldiers were killed in the fighting, and the remaining nearly 1,700 were subjected to the unimaginable cruelty of the Japanese prison camps. Yet, years after the guns fell silent and the survivors returned home, the tragic tale of Hong Kong found its redemption in the unwavering memory of one man, Sergeant Major John Robert Osborne. The official presentation of the Victoria Cross, VC, the Commonwealth's highest award for gallantry, to his widow, Mrs. Ellen Osborne, at Rideau Hall in 1947, was more than just a ceremony. It was Canada's way of reclaiming honor from the ashes of defeat. The citation for the VC, read aloud to the nation, confirmed the extraordinary, almost mythological nature of his sacrifice, ensuring his act would be etched into the nation's military consciousness. Osborne's VC was not merely a medal. It became a powerful, enduring symbol that redefined the Canadian contribution to the global conflict. It demonstrated that even in a battle that was logistically doomed from the start, The Canadian soldier showed a depth of courage and moral fortitude that shocked even the enemy. The full story, pieced together from the testimonies of the men he saved, provided proof that the spirit of the Allied forces was unbreakable. This single, final act of defiance by an exhausted, surrounded soldier became a microcosm of the entire war, a testament that the ultimate victory would belong not to those with the initial advantage, but to those with the unbreakable will to sacrifice. The Japanese command, who had witnessed the scene on Mount Butler, learned that day that they were fighting an enemy whose personal loyalty to one another transcended any military code, foreshadowing the relentless, difficult campaigns that would eventually lead to the defeat of the Imperial Army. The legacy of John Osborne is woven into the fabric of Canadian identity. His name graces military buildings, schools, and streets across Canada, ensuring that the lessons of the Battle of Hong Kong are not forgotten. The Hong Kong Veterans Association of Canada, established by the men who survived the ordeal, ensures that the memory of their fallen comrades, especially Osborne, remains vibrant. He represents the courage of the common man thrust into extraordinary circumstances and choosing self-abnegation for the greater good. His story serves as a constant, sobering reminder of the immense price paid by the Canadians in the Pacific Theatre, often overlooked in the grand narrative of the European War. The men Osborne saved went on to live their lives, their existence a permanent testament to his final, perfect act of duty. The tragedy of Hong Kong was the first taste of war for many Canadians, a baptism by fire that exposed the unpreparedness of the Commonwealth forces in the Far East. Yet, it also revealed the steely resolve that would characterize Canadian troops for the remainder of the war in every theatre. From Sicily to the beaches of Normandy, Osborne's Victoria Cross became the silent, powerful answer to any who might question the dedication or fighting spirit of the Canadian soldier. The broken soldier the Japanese captured was, in reality, the most dangerous kind of enemy. One who had accepted his doom but refused to allow it to claim his comrades. In the annals of military history, John Osborne is remembered as a hero who, with one quick, impossible decision, turned a tactical loss into a profound moral victory. His sacrifice on the shattered peak of Mount Butler remains one of the most powerful, chilling, and ultimately hopeful stories of the Second World War. It is the story of a common Canadian soldier whose final, deliberate act of selflessness was so shocking, so profound, that it gave the Japanese command a terrible glimpse into the unyielding nature of the enemy that would ultimately bring about their doom. This is not just a story of a Canadian hero. It is a universal story about the true cost of commitment and the infinite value of a single human life saved by the sacrifice of another. The story of Sergeant Major John Osborne is one of duty that transcends even death. He saved 4 lives, but his sacrifice inspired a nation. If this incredible, untold story of Canadian bravery resonated with you, please hit the like button and share this video to honor the memory of the Winnipeg Grenadiers. And tell us this: if John Osborne's heroism defined the Canadian spirit in the Pacific, what single act of bravery do you think best represents the spirit of your own country in the Second World War? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the forgotten heroes and pivotal moments of world history.